I think at the time, and I went to school in Iraq, and so we learnt in our history lessons about a lot of the big names, Ibn Sina, Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn al-Haytham, these great figures in Arabic and Islamic science. But I didn't learn about them as scientists. I didn't learn about the science that they carried out, but simply that these were great giants that the Arab and Muslim world is very proud of. Right. It's only recently that I've started to look into exactly what their contribution was to science and how it's led to the science that we have today. Well, I've always been interested in the personalities behind the science. So all through my scientific career, I've always read the biographies of the big names like Einstein and Newton and so on. And if I would list all the top 10 scientists, they would all be European. And so it's only in the last maybe year or two when I've started thinking more about some of these other big names in science. I think, well, actually, some of those, even in the top 10 greatest ever scientists, would have been Muslim scientists. Right. And so I've started looking into what do we know about their lives and what do we know about their contributions. And I've gradually got more and more fascinated by the subject and realised it's a subject that most people in the West don't know. We have to be careful because people like Copernicus are regarded as, he's one of the greatest of all astronomers. Right. And what we don't want to do is give the impression that in fact he wasn't really that clever and that everything was all done by Muslim scholars before that. Right. His contribution was very important. What he did was show for definite that the Earth goes around the Sun, not the Sun around the Earth. Right. Now there were Arabic Muslim astronomers who did come up with the idea, and many of them said, well, actually maybe the Earth goes around the Sun or the Sun goes around the Earth. The numbers are the same. So Al-Tusi, Ibn al-Shatir were scholars who influenced Copernicus. Right. I don't want to go so far as to say he copied word for word. But certainly if you look at, people like George Saliba in the US has studied this, and he shows quite clearly that there are figures in Copernicus's manuscript that are very, very similar to figures in manuscripts by earlier Muslim astronomers. My motivation was simply that this was a fascinating story that's untold, and it doesn't matter that it's a Muslim heritage, it's just something, world heritage that we don't know about. Yes. But I can see that it could well play a very, very important role in the world today. Islam is so much under pressure to show itself as a tolerant religion, and that it's not all about extremism. If we can point back to a period 1,000 years ago when Islam was open and tolerant and inclusive and wanting to understand the world, then maybe in the West they can say, well, maybe today it's the same religion. Yeah. Why don't we look on the positive side today? It will be a gradual process. What I'd like to see, and I think what a lot of scholars in this area would like to see, is that school children in the West, when they learn about their physics and their chemistry and their biology, it's not just the European names that appear, but it is the Abbasid and Islamic scholars. So Ibn al-Haytham is a great example as the first true physicist, and he did lots of experiments with optics, with lights and prisms and mirrors and things. You never hear about that. You hear about Isaac Newton's work. Now, I'm not saying Ibn al-Haytham was better than Isaac Newton or he did everything before, but there's some recognition. There was an important contribution, and I'm not trying to force it in. He is worthy of a mention. So I would like to see all around the world when we learn about science and go back in history, it's not just the European names that appear. Well, I think, I don't want to say there's, some sort of conspiracy theory against it, but there's certainly, you get the feeling, because certainly Western Europe was in the Dark Ages during those periods, it wasn't advanced, and or the whole issue of the Crusades, although it was driven by religion, it was also driven by envy. That the Christian world in Europe could look on the Islamic world and see how wealthy and advanced the civilization was, and they wanted a piece of that. And so you wonder then, after the rise of the European Renaissance, that negative attitude towards the Islamic world may have carried on,
Right.
and there wasn't anyone on the Islamic side reminding the world of that heritage. When it declined, it all went very quiet, and now, over the last few centuries, there hasn't been anything for the Islamic world to shout about. Actually, yes. I mean, a lot of the names were familiar to me anyway, and probably familiar to people who know something about this period.
Mm-hmm.
But one particular scientist who stood out for me was Al-Biruni,
Right.
who's a Persian scholar. He came from the same part of the world as Ibn Sina, Avicenna.
Right.
But he's nowhere near as well known. Even in the West, you hear on Radio 4 there have been programs about Avicenna and
Right.
Western scholars and historians talking about his philosophy and so on. Al-Biruni was an amazing scientist. He did so much. He developed so much mathematics and astronomy and geography and anthropology. And you think, crikey, this guy is like he's Leonardo da Vinci,
Yeah.
But no. So what's really exciting is people don't know about him. So it's a story you can tell that is being heard for the first time. It's a wonderful place. I'm actually now, as well as doing TV series, I'm writing a book on the subject, and the book is going to be called The House of Wisdom. So the focus of this is not a scholarly work in the sense that it's aimed at experts, but it's aimed at the general audience. But it's a book of serious non-fiction, centered around this institute. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, is thought to have been around for a long time, right from the early days of the Abbasid period. But initially it was seen just as a library. They'd started translating books from the Greek and from other languages, Persian and so on. And so this was a place where they stored books, and it wasn't much more than a library or some sort of repository for books. It was during the period of Al-Ma'mun, the Khalifs of the Abbasid period, where it changed. It seems, because there's not many records of it today, so it seems as though it then changed from just being a place where translations were carried out or books were collected to a proper academy.
Right.
And Al-Ma'mun was very, very keen on scholarship, and he's a wonderful patron of science.
Right.
So I mean, that's what helped. He would pay the best minds, in the world who were living in that region at the time, to come and live and work in the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah. And so for that period, this is round about the middle of the 9th century AD,
Right.
and for several hundred years, that was the place to be. So it's like nowadays we talk about Oxford and Cambridge or
Harvard.
Princeton or Harvard,
Yeah.
the places where the Nobel Prize winners are. That's where the equivalent of the Nobel Prize winners in the world were. Probably a century or so, it spread.
Right.
And so not all the big names actually worked there by the 9th, 10th, 11th century. There was a second House of Wisdom in Cairo, in Cordoba. There were other places in Iran that sprung up. So once that started, and that notion of scholarship and patronage of the sciences by the sultans and caliphs in that area became a good thing. It became fashionable.
Right.
And so various other places sprung after that. But that was regarded as the true original place, the true academy where the golden age flourished. As I say, it was very much translation.
Right.
And the books that were translated essentially were books on mathematics, medicine, astronomy.
Right.
So Ptolemy's Almagest, which is a book on astronomy, some of the Greek physicians' work. What really flourished there was things like mathematics. Al-Khawarizmi was the famous. He wrote the first proper book on algebra, and of course we know that the English word algebra comes from the Arabic al-jabr.
Yes, no problem.
And there were other mathematicians, the Banu Musa brothers, who worked there. Al-Kindi, who was the philosopher of the Arabs.
Right.
He worked in getting a lot of the mathematics from India over to the Abbasid, to Baghdad. So the Indian numerals and the use of zero.
Right.
So he was a philosopher, but also a mathematician. So mathematics for me was the thing that stood out most in that period. but then also medicine and astronomy and philosophy was developed as well. I don't think it's unique to the House of Wisdom. It is certainly commonplace at that time, simply because not that much science was known. I mean, the more we've developed, the more we learn about our world, the more information there is. And so really to push the frontiers of knowledge further, you have to specialize more and more. There's just you simply can't learn everything there is to know. So it's inevitable these days. I don't think it's a fault of our system. It's just inevitable given the diverse multitude of different scientific disciplines. Given the information and knowledge that was there, they were pushing the frontiers. They knew more than anyone else in the world on that subject at that time, and they covered many subjects. They really were masters of all. Yes, I mean that's very interesting, because if you think back to that period, that was 600-700 years after Christianity spread in that region. But there wasn't this scholarship or this flourishing of a golden age in science due to the spread of Christianity. It was the spread of Islam that encouraged scholars to think about the world about them. At the time, the message was very clear. You know, that you go out and study al-samawati wal-ard. You know, you go out and study the world around you to understand it, and seek knowledge wherever you can find it. That was very clear from the words of the Prophet, from the words of the Quran, that that's what they should do. So it was very much driven by their theological motivations and for their need to understand and interpret the words of the Quran. Despite the fact that not all the scholars were Muslims. You know, they made Christian and Jewish scholars. It was a very inclusive period. But underneath all that, the reason why the Khalifas, you know, in Baghdad were promoting it was underlying that was a theological reason. So if not for Islam, it wouldn't have happened. You know, that's absolutely clear. I don't think anyone could argue. In a way, they are different in the sense that, you know, a religious person may argue no, because, you know, so, you know, a Muslim will say, well, everything we want to know about the world that God feels is important for us to know, He would have written for us in the Quran anyway. But as a scientist, you know, your job is to learn about the world using a particular method. You don't learn about science by going to religious books. You learn about science by doing experiments, by coming up with